Crusaders versus Turks, 1097 AD Battle of Dorylaeum, the desert that tested faith. This is the story you clicked for, the day a marching army split in two, the day a sea of horse archers tried to erase the First Crusade before noon. Anatolia. Summer heat rises off the plain, like breath from an oven. A dust curtain opens on the vanguard. Tired men, cracked lips, banners wilting. While somewhere behind them, across miles of shimmering air, the rest of the Crusader host lags out of sight. A sudden tremor moves through the grass. Hooves, whistles. Then a black ring of Seljuk riders seals around the camp like a tightening noose. One verifiable truth to anchor you here. By midday, these riders had loosed tens of thousands of arrows, enough to darken the sun and make shields sing like drums. And still, the ring closes, a boy clutches a waterskin, a knight spits blood and sets his feet. Wagons grind into a rough barricade. You can smell the leather, the sweat, the fear. A red kite flag snaps at the edge of the world, then vanishes in the glare. What breaks a ring of horsemen? What holds when everything screams to run? The answer lies a few miles away, hidden by heat, by dust, and by a decision no one expected. We begin there, and we do not resolve it yet, because at Dorylaeum, the first mistake didn't kill them. The second almost did. The split road and the encirclement. They thought the worst was behind them. Nicaea had fallen. Banners had brightened. Songs had returned to throats that days earlier could barely swallow. So they divided the road, not out of arrogance, but out of need. The land in front of them was too harsh for one mass of men and animals. Two columns would drink more easily, forage more widely, move more quickly. The vanguard, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, their knights and foot, their squires and cooks, and the children who clung to wagon boards, stepped ahead into a morning of white light. The grass here was brittle. The plain near Dorylaeum was a bowl of glare and blown grit. Behind them, the second column, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bishop Adhémar of Le Puy, moved at its own rhythm, a slow tide of iron and prayer far beyond the horizon. Between them lay distance. Distance is an enemy with soft hands. It doesn't shout. It just waits for another enemy to see it first. A scout returns with his horse foam-laced and eyes fixed on something he can't name. He points to the low ridges in the southeast, where a haze has begun to move. The men think it's wind, a trick of heat. Then they hear it, the thin, cutting whistle of a horn that is not their language. More horns answer, like flint on glass. The haze fractures into mounted shapes, hundreds, then thousands, lively as mercury, wheeling, spreading, tightening. Bohemond orders the wagons inward. Axles jam. Drivers curse. Women unload sacks of grain, barrels of water, anything to lighten the wheels. The first arrows slap into the wood with thunks that feel like punches to the gut. Shields climb into the air. A boy named Arno holds a waterskin bigger than his chest and runs low, his mother's hand at his back. A knight laughs too loudly and bangs his helmet with his gauntlet to hide a tremor in his jaw. The ring becomes visible. Seljuk riders in layered silk and leather, faces veiled against dust, their horses small, quick, tireless. They ride the edge of sight, never too close, never still. Each rider draws, releases, the bow like a second heartbeat. Arrows come with the sound of ripping linen. Horses breathe in clouds. A red kite standard, bright as spilled wine, snaps and is gone behind a wave of riders that fold over the ridge like surf. Most people never knew this detail. By midday, the arrow storm was so constant that some Crusaders learned to count breaths by the rhythm of strikes. Every 15 heartbeats, another shiver ran through the wagon boards. Every 20, another shout for water. Every 30, a horse went down hard, kicking dust like flour into a baker's shop. The sun didn't move. Time became a circle, cruelly mirroring the rider's path. And this is where everything changed. The enemy expected panic. The Seljuks had shattered bigger armies than this by cracking nerves, not shields. Circles tempt you to chase. Riders tempt you to run. Bohemond did neither. He ordered a fence of lances to rise inside the wagon ring, a hedgehog of wood and iron. Archers crouched under shields, shooting only when a rider committed, never wasting breath on the horizon. He placed the bravest women at the barrels and the bravest boys at the straps, ferrying water, bandages, and words, not heroic speeches. Just simple iron words. Hold, wait, breathe. But here's the shocking truth. A line of men had already begun to waver. The Turks had slipped a wedge of fire arrows against a pocket where cloth and straw and dry wood made the air itch with danger. A small blaze licked at a wagon wheel, and heat turned anger into fear. One flat-footed sprint could have ripped a hole in the ring and the day along with it. It didn't happen, for one reason that historians whisper about but rarely paint in colour. A handful of knights dismounted in the worst of it, knelt into the dust, and drove their spear butts into the earth like tent pegs. They made themselves anchors. And when you tie a ship to the sea learns patience. The Seljuks tested the ring. They poured inward, halted, wheeled away, poured inward again, a tide learning the shape of a cliff. Arrows darkened the sun. The Crusaders learned the music of impact, the shiver of wood, the metallic bark of rivets enduring. Every few minutes a small team darted forward, grabbed a fallen man by his shoulders, dragged him back through the ladder of spear shafts, and set him down in the shade of a canvas flap that was not shade at all, just thinner light. The wounded asked for water. The living lied to them with a smile and said, "Plenty." Most people never knew this detail. The bishop fought like a soldier when he had to, but in this hour, his contribution was angles. The vanguard's clerics looked at the lie of the ground, the shallow dip, the low ridge in the west, the seam where dust rose a little too directly, and guessed, with the math of shepherds, where the second column would appear if it came at all. They wrote that hope onto their courage like chalk on a shield boss. It was not comfort, it was a direction, and this is where everything changed again. A sudden quiet fell, not silence. No such gift exists in a ring of horses, but a thinning of sound, like wind moving past a door instead of under it. The riders drew back into a wider pattern. The Crusaders' heads lifted. No charge came, no shout, only the flicker of banners at distance, and then smoke, not fire, dust, columns of it. The world beyond the circle was moving. What happened next? No historian expected to be so close, because the relief should have arrived hours later. The split road had stretched the host thin, but it had also given it two faces, and one of them, Godfrey's, was faster today. Scouts had found a cut in the land, a ravine that funneled sound away and hooves forward. The second column was not simply approaching, it was almost there. The men in the ring did not cheer. They did not have breath for it. Instead, something more dangerous happened. They believed. Here is your first payoff. The reason the ring held long enough for help to matter was not a miracle, not luck, not even numbers. It was discipline inside thirst. It was the decision not to chase the riders, not to bleed strength into the empty air. It was the hard choice to hold, to waste no arrow, to keep the water moving, to make a camp of smoke and fear into a fortress with its hinges on patience. The Seljuks had a circle. The Crusaders built a center. Before we uncover the next layer of this, before we climb that ravine with Godfrey's riders and watch a horizon crack, make sure you're with us for the long ride. Subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments, which ancient battle broke a circle in your mind? Your support lets us keep telling history the way it deserves to be told. Alive, breathing, and dangerously close. The riders sensed it too, the change in the wind's direction. One commander on the Seljuk flank raised a curved sword and pointed not at the ring, but past it, over it, through it, to the ridge where dust boiled into view. They began to shift in answer, a wheel turning its spokes toward a new threat. The Crusader ring steadied. Men who had been squinting into the glare now blinked to clear tears born of smoke and hope. A woman with a scarf tied over her mouth lifted a bucket and passed it along the line like liturgy. But fate had something else planned. Kili Arslan did not fear numbers. He feared angles. He had beaten knights before and would beat them again by cutting their courage into separated threads. The rear column's approach didn't frighten him. It excited him. A ring with a hammer coming is only dangerous if you let the hammer strike. If instead you unstring the ring at the right stitch, the hammer falls into air. He signaled for a feigned retreat on the ring's eastern quarter, inviting a surge. He wanted a gap, a flood of hot, desperate men trying to seize glory, right when the real blade was coming around behind them. Riders of Rum and the art of the circle. The heat had become a second sun, one in the sky, the other burning from the sand itself. Every step, every breath shimmered with exhaustion. Above it all, on a ridge of fractured stone, Kilij Arslan watched the Crusader camp through a haze of dust and memory. He'd been here before, years earlier, when a different crusading tide had tried to drown his land and failed. He knew their hunger, their pride, their clumsy discipline. But this time, he believed he'd learned the rhythm of their hearts. He raised his hand. The Seljuk riders shifted formation like a flock of birds reading the same thought. They spread wide, circling faster, hooves drumming in waves. Each horseman rode with 2 quivers. The bows curved like smiles that never reached their eyes. From above, it looked beautiful. Terrible, but beautiful. A dance of control and cruelty in equal measure. The riders were ghosts of the plain, born to speed, raised to endurance. Down below, inside the wagon ring, that beauty translated into chaos. Arrows fell in flurries. Some split shields, some pinned cloaks to the dirt. The Crusaders had learned to crouch low, to move only when necessary. They could hear the laughter of the riders, a cold, almost playful sound. But here's the shocking truth. Kili Arslan wasn't laughing because he was winning. He was laughing because he couldn't believe how long they were holding. He'd expected them to break by mid-morning. Instead, they fought like roots, not flames. Flames die without air. Roots dig deeper. Bohemon's defense was unnatural to the Turks. It didn't rage. It endured. The arrows met a silence that unnerved the horsemen. The Sultan adjusted his plan. He called for the feigned retreats to tighten their circles, to draw the Crusaders out. If even one gate opened in that wagon fortress, the Seljuks would pour through like water. He turned to his captains, grizzled men, veterans of Byzantine wars, and gave a signal with his eyes. They understood. Patience was over. The storm would now strike at the edges. The first wave hit the north side. A blur of hooves and banners. Shields groaned. Men grunted. Horses screamed. The air thickened with grit and smoke. A single wagon caught fire, flames licking the canvas roof. A priest beat at it with his cloak until sparks burned holes through the fabric. In that orange flicker, for the first time, the defenders saw what the Seljuks truly were. Fast, precise, mercilessly coordinated. Most people never knew this detail. The Seljuks carried bells tied beneath their horses' saddles. When they charged, the jingling masked their numbers. When they wheeled away, the silence felt like disappearance. To the Crusaders, it sounded like war itself was breathing in and out. And this is where everything changed. From the southern rim of the battlefield came a rumble. Not from the Crusaders, not yet, but from the land itself. The ravine that Godfrey's men had been climbing began to hum with motion. A scout crested the top and froze. Below, the plain was a spinning wheel of dust and light. Above, the sky seemed to boil. He waved his sword once, a signal lost to the wind. Back in the ring, Bohemond saw it, the faint glimmer of armor in the far distance. He knew what it meant. He also knew what would happen if the Turks realized it too soon. He whispered orders. Hold your arrows, tighten the line, make them think we're done. The Seljuks, seeing the Crusaders huddle in silence, thought victory had at last cracked open. They surged forward again, closer this time, desperate to finish it before the second column arrived. Hooves churned sand into a storm. Archers rode by and fired point blank, the arrows clattering against helmets, slicing through gaps in mail. One struck a knight's throat and pinned him to the wagon board behind him. He died, still gripping his sword. But fate had something else planned. The first shot came from the west, unexpected, brutal, echoing through the dust like thunder under a burial shroud. Godfrey's knights burst from the ravine with the force of an avalanche. Spears leveled, banners snapping, horses pounding downhill. The Seljuks turned too late. The circle that had been perfect all morning now had a tear in its rim. And yet, the moment didn't turn cleanly to triumph. Because Kilij Arslan wasn't a man who feared a surprise. He lived by them. He wheeled his right wing, shouting commands lost under the roar. The riders pulled back in elegant spirals, drawing the Crusader charge further and further into the open flatland. Dust blinded friend and foe alike. The Crusaders, drunk on the charge's momentum, followed too far. Most people never knew this detail. The Seljuks' retreat wasn't disorder, it was geometry. They rode in precise arcs, calculated so that each turn would allow fresh ranks to shoot from new angles. Godfrey's men, heavy and sweating in the armor that gleamed only minutes ago, found themselves surrounded, again. From his ridge, Kilij Arslan smiled once more. The trap had flipped, but deep inside the storm, the Crusaders remembered the earlier silence. Bohemond's defense had taught them restraint. Instead of scattering, they formed clusters, small, brutal knots of men with shields overlapping, lances stabbing outward. They became moving fortresses, iron cells cutting through the swirl. The Seljuks' arrows began to run thin. Their horses, sweating and gasping, stumbled on the churned sand. The rhythm of the battle shifted. The air, once filled with the whistle of arrows, now carried the deeper, slower sound of melee. Steel on bone, screams swallowed by heat. A Turk captain rode too close and met the blunt side of a Crusader axe. He fell. His horse bolted, dragging his banner through the dirt. The sight rippled through the riders. Small but poisonous. Doubt is louder than horns. Kilij Arslan felt it too. He raised his bow, loosed one final arrow toward the dust, and missed. A sign, perhaps, that even kings lose aim when the sun tilts toward defeat. Still, he would not retreat. He gave a final order: burn the plain. Fires erupted on the edge of the battlefield as oil flasks shattered and the grass ignited. The smoke crawled across the ground like a living thing. Bohemond saw it and understood. The Sultan wasn't conceding the field. He was erasing it. And this is where everything changed again. The fire should have crushed them. Instead, the wind turned. The smoke blew back into the faces of the Seljuk lines, obscuring their signals, choking their horses. In that smothering grey, the Crusader forces united. Bohemond's ring breaking open at last. Godfrey's column driving through the breach. For the first time all day, the two halves of the army were one. What happened next? No historian expected to read so vividly. The Seljuk lines collapsed not from slaughter, but from exhaustion. Riders dropped bows and fled toward the east, their silhouettes fading into the smoke. The sound of hooves dwindled into silence. The plain was theirs. But victory came with no cheer. The Crusaders stood among the ashes, too tired to lift their swords. The sun had bled itself dry, and through the fading heat haze, Bohemond's gaze found something that made his breath stop. Across the plain, far beyond the blackened grass, a shimmer of movement lingered. Too deliberate, too quiet to be fleeing stragglers. A second force, smaller perhaps, but waiting, watching. He turned to Godfrey. He's not finished. The wind carried the faint echo of horns again. Distant, mocking, deliberate. And that's where we pause, because the desert that had tested faith was not yet done with its lesson. The true heart of Dorylaeum, the choice between pursuit and survival, was only just beginning. Miles of heat, miles of hope night fell without stars. The battlefield steamed under a thin moon, the sand blackened by smoke and blood. The Crusaders sat in silence, the air too thick to speak through. Somewhere in the dark, a horse screamed and went quiet. It was over, or so they thought. Bohemond stood at the edge of the burned plain, his armour crusted with ash. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, iron, sweat, and something sour that only came after fear had dried. He listened, waiting for silence to become peace. It didn't. Far to the east, where the hills folded into shadow, the faint glimmer of torches flickered like eyes that refused to close. He knew it wasn't over. They had survived the circle, endured the arrows, and crushed the charge, but the Seljuk Sultan hadn't vanished. Kila Yarslan was too clever to die in daylight. He was waiting for the next mistake. Most people never knew this detail. That night, the Crusaders didn't celebrate. They didn't sing hymns or boast of victory. They whispered prayers over the wounded and tightened the reins on horses too tired to stand. Every man who had survived the storm knew it could come again before dawn. Godfrey approached Bohemond with a look that could slice armour. "We've bled the desert dry," he said, "but the desert doesn't die." He pointed east. They're out there, regrouping, watching, testing. How far faith can walk before it breaks. And this is where everything changed, because in that moment, when exhaustion should have chained them to the ground, the Crusaders decided to move. Not back to safety, forward, into the dark. They couldn't stay. The dead poisoned the air, and the heat would rise again at sunrise. If Kilij struck before morning, the army would be trapped between ash and emptiness. So they marched, slow, staggering, their footsteps whispering across the plain like ghosts looking for water. Hours passed. The desert turned silver. Helmets glowed faintly in the moonlight, and armour creaked like a funeral dirge. Some men walked barefoot, others dragged broken spears for balance. At the front, Godfrey's cross banner led them toward a distant ridge, a faint outline against the stars. Bohemond glanced back at the wagons, the wounded, the women clutching what little they had. He could see the toll of victory. More than 100 men limping, dozens carried on shields. The triumph of Dorylaeum had no cheers, only the sound of laboured breathing. Most people never knew this detail. The Crusaders didn't find water for 2 days after the battle. They drank from skins that smelled of leather and dust. They washed wounds with wine, their only antiseptic. And yet, miraculously, they kept moving, because to stop in that heat was to die standing up. But fate had something else planned. At dawn, the first light revealed something strange. The ridge ahead wasn't a ridge. It was a slope leading into a narrow valley, walled by rock on both sides. At its mouth stood a single banner, fluttering red in the wind. the same kite standard they had seen at the battle's start. Kilij Arslan had left them a message. Bohemon's hand went to his sword, but Godfrey raised his palm. "No." His voice was calm, almost reverent. "He wants us to follow. He's leading us into the hills." Bohemon's eyes narrowed. "Or he's running." Godfrey shook his head. "Not him. He doesn't run. He teaches." And this was true. Kilij Arslan was more than a warrior. He was a strategist who understood patience like a weapon. He'd tasted defeat, but not humiliation. The Sultan was setting the stage for something else. The Crusaders entered the valley cautiously, expecting ambush at every echo. Shadows shifted on the rock walls. The air was cooler here, but heavy, like breath held too long. Their horses shied, sniffing at the dust. Suddenly, hooves. A single rider appeared at the far end, cloaked in grey, moving with unhurried grace. He stopped halfway, dismounted, and left something in the dirt. A black feathered arrow. Then he turned and vanished into the haze. Bohemond walked to the arrow and bent to pick it up. The shaft was painted with streaks of white ash. A message. He looked back at Godfrey. "He's marking the path. He wants us to follow." Godfrey's answer came slowly. "Then we follow, until he makes his mistake." But here's the shocking truth. The mistake would not be his. By midday, the Crusaders had marched deep into the valley. The terrain grew tighter, the air sharper. Ahead lay the edge of the Anatolian plateau, a desolate sweep of rock where even the wind seemed lost. They thought the Turks had vanished for good. Then came the first arrow. It didn't strike a man. It struck the ground ahead of them, quivering upright. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the path ahead was lined with them, black shafts sticking from the dust like warning teeth. A murmur rippled through the column. "Trap!" Bohemond raised his hand. Shields up, but nothing came. The silence stretched thin until it felt ready to snap. And this is where everything changed again. The sound came not from ahead, but from behind. A thunder of hooves echoing down the narrow pass. Dust rose, and from it emerged hundreds of horsemen. Seljuks, their faces masked, their bows drawn. The Crusaders turned, their lines fracturing in the confined space. The valley that had seemed like safety became a tomb. Bohemond roared orders, his voice lost in the panic. Men slammed shields together, horses reared, wagons jammed at the pass's mouth. Arrows screamed through the air, striking sparks from metal and cries from flesh. Godfrey's knights forced a wedge forward, trying to break free. But every direction led into more dust, more death. The Turks had sealed both ends. Most people never knew this detail. Kilij Arslan's men carried horn mirrors polished to a blinding shine. When the sun climbed high, they turned them on the Crusader line, scattering glare into their eyes until they fought half blind. It wasn't sorcery. It was science, weaponized by faith. For nearly an hour, the battle raged in that suffocating corridor. The Crusaders fought like trapped wolves, savage and silent. Bohemond's shield split. Godfrey's horse fell, pierced through the chest. The noise of clashing steel became one long heartbeat of survival. Then, another sound. Low, rhythmic, distant. Drums. Not Turkish drums, Christian ones. Raymond's army. They had arrived. The hills above the pass erupted with movement, hundreds of figures pouring down, banners of red and gold catching the sunlight. The Turks, startled, faltered. In that single moment of hesitation, Bohemond saw the break. He shouted one word. Forward! The Crusaders surged as one, driving through the narrow gap, trampling the fallen, hacking through the riders who remained. Dust filled every breath. Sunlight flashed on steel. When it cleared, the valley was theirs. The Turks melted away into the cliffs, vanishing like smoke. Silence fell again. Only this time, it felt like victory, or so it seemed, because when the Crusaders climbed to the ridge beyond, what they saw froze the breath in their throats. The land opened into a vast plain stretching toward the east, bare, endless, and shimmering with heat. And on that horizon, a single black banner was rising. Kilij Arslan hadn't been crushed. He had only retreated to the next battlefield. Bohemond stared at it for a long moment, his voice a whisper more than a word. He's waiting, Godfrey nodded. Then, so are we. The camera of history lingers there, a banner swaying against the sky, a promise of vengeance yet unpaid. Because the desert that tested faith had not finished its trial. It had only begun to change the men who walked through it. Break the circle. The sun rose like a blade, thin, merciless, and silent. It cut through the smoke that still clung to the valley, slicing light across armor slick with dried sweat. Below, the Crusaders moved like men reborn, but not renewed. They had won nothing yet. They were still in the Sultan's land, and the land itself wanted them gone. Bohemond stood at the front line as the first wind of morning scraped over the plain. His eyes followed that distant black banner, the one that had haunted their horizon since dawn. It didn't move closer, it simply waited. A symbol, not a signal, the kind of patience that spoke louder than defiance. Godfrey joined him, his face hollow from sleeplessness. "He's mocking us," he said. Bohemond nodded, "or warning us." Behind them, the Crusader camp was a breathing wound. Tents half torn, water nearly gone, horses shaking from thirst. The smell of rot mixed with dust, and yet no one spoke of retreat. They had come too far, fought too long, bled too much. Pride was all that was left to drink. Most people never knew this detail. That morning, some knights melted snow scraped from shaded rocks to fill their helmets and shared it like communion. The desert had no mercy, but men still found faith in small things. And this is where everything changed. From the east came the sound of distant horns, low, rising, echoing in layers across the open ground. The Seljuks were not gone. They had drawn back only to form anew. Lines appeared on the horizon like stitches across the skin of the earth. Hundreds, then thousands. The Crusaders gathered on the slopes, watching dust curl into the sky. They saw the riders spread wide, too wide for counting. It wasn't a direct charge this time. It was something slower, crueler, the art of the circle again, perfected now by experience. Bohemond's jaw clenched. "He means to erase us properly." Godfrey stepped forward, raising his sword to the light. "Then we give him something that cannot be erased." The men formed lines, shields overlapping, spears like forest trunks in the wind. The archers knelt behind, crossbows angled low. Priests moved among them, murmuring blessings half swallowed by wind. The banners of Christendom, faded, torn, blackened by smoke, rose for what could be the last time. The Seljuks advanced in graceful arcs, their formations spreading like ink in water. Arrows lifted skyward in one sweeping motion, a wave that caught the sun and vanished into flight. The sound was endless. Shields rang. Horses screamed. The Crusaders crouched low as shafts hammered down in rain without clouds. One man fell, another replaced him. The line held. But here's the shocking truth. This second storm wasn't meant to kill them all. It was meant to drain them, to make them thirsty, to make them angry. Because Kili Arslan had learned that patience could wound deeper than steel. The Sultan rode high above his troops, his white horse shimmering like smoke against the dust. He raised his hand and the arrows stopped. Silence rolled across the plain, thick and heavy, and then movement. The riders split, forming two halves of a crescent, curving around the Crusader flanks. Bohemond saw it too late. "He's closing us again." The circle tightened. The Turks' tactics were poetry in motion, speed, rhythm, precision. The Crusaders' strength was weight, discipline, stubbornness. One was water, the other stone, and for a moment, it looked as though water would win. But fate had something else planned. A horn sounded from the Crusader rear. A sound deep and unfamiliar. It wasn't their usual battle call. It was the sound of desperation turned into courage. Raymond of Toulouse had arrived, late but alive, with a contingent of heavy cavalry that glimmered like a promise in the sun. Most people never knew this detail. Raymond had broken off from the main army days earlier to chase a Turkish raiding band. He returned now by accident or providence, riding hard toward the echo of horns and the scent of smoke. His men had ridden for 18 hours without rest. The Seljuks didn't see them until too late. As the circle closed, Raymond's knights smashed into its rear flank, a hammer against glass. The shockwave rippled through dust and panic. Horses collided. Arrows scattered wild. The circle cracked. Bohemond saw it and roared one word. "Forward!" The Crusader line surged, spears thrusting, shields slamming, voices rising in one raw thunder. They didn't charge. They advanced like a tide, crushing forward through the chaos. The Seljuks, caught between the hammer and the anvil, tried to flee through their own dust. The desert that had sheltered them became their prison. For the first time, the Turks wavered. Kili Arslan's command dissolved into confusion. He tried to rally them, his voice cutting across the chaos, but the smoke from Raymond's assault blurred vision. Smothered breath, and turned orders into ghosts. Arslan drew his sword and rode straight into the heart of the fight. For a moment, his banner vanished entirely. The Crusaders didn't know it, but they had come within moments of collapse themselves. The heat had drained every muscle, every will, but adrenaline and faith burned hotter than thirst. They fought as if the entire world was watching through the eyes of heaven. And this is where everything changed again. The Sultan's horse was struck by a spear. It reared, twisted, and threw him into the dust. For a heartbeat, he disappeared beneath the wave of his own men. Rumors spread faster than truth. The Sultan is dead. The Seljuk lines shuddered. Fear traveled like wildfire. The Crusaders pressed harder. Every cry became a drumbeat. Every heartbeat became prophecy. But Kilay Arslan was not dead. He rose, blood streaked across his face, mounted another horse, and fled toward the horizon. His army followed, first in retreat, then in panic, until the plain was empty, but for bodies and broken banners. Bohemond lowered his sword. The battlefield was theirs. At last, what happened next? No historian expected. When the dust cleared, the Crusaders saw the land ahead. The vast, cracked road stretching toward Antioch. Beyond it lay the true heart of their journey and the real trials to come. The Battle of Dorylaeum was won, but at a price that left the survivors hollow-eyed and trembling. They found the Sultan's banner half buried in the sand. It fluttered weakly in the heat. Godfrey looked at it for a long time before speaking. This was never about land, he said quietly. It was about endurance. Bohemond turned his gaze east, where the smoke thinned into the horizon, and endurance has only begun. The wind rose again, tugging at the burnt edges of their flags. Men knelt in prayer. Others simply stared at the emptiness, knowing this was not the end, only a pause, because the desert that had tested faith would soon test something even deeper. Ahead lay Antioch, betrayal, hunger, and the long shadow of what victory costs. And somewhere beyond that horizon, Kilay Arslan rode on, alive, angry, and waiting for the next dawn. The story of Dorylaeum was not finished. It had only taught them how to suffer better. After the ring, the wind that once carried the stench of war now swept quietly over the empty field. The dead lay where the desert had claimed them, and the living, those who still moved, did so in slow disbelief. For the first time in weeks, there was no enemy on the horizon, only the whisper of banners, torn and exhausted, swaying above the survivors like relics of a promise half kept. Bohemond rode through the aftermath with eyes that refused to blink. The bodies of Turks and Franks lay tangled, their blood dried to the same color. Victory had no smell of glory, only of dust, sweat, and loss. He passed a wagon half crushed, its wheels buried in sand, a child asleep beneath it clutching her mother's cross. He dismounted, knelt, and pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. The sun rose slow and pitiless. It illuminated what the night had hidden, the cost. Most people never knew this detail. Nearly 1/10 of the Crusader army died that day, not from arrows, but from thirst after the battle. The wells near Dorylaeum were fouled, filled with sand and corpses by retreating Turks. Every mouthful of water became a prayer, every drop a currency heavier than gold. And this is where everything changed. In the morning light, the survivors gathered on the ridge, looking east toward the long road that led deeper into Anatolia. There was no cheer. They didn't sing. They stood in silence while priests murmured mass over the fallen. Godfrey's face was pale beneath his helm, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "This desert does not forgive," he said, "but if it cannot kill us, it will teach us." Bohemond stared into the horizon, where the haze of heat shimmered. He could almost see movement, phantoms of riders far away, watching. "He's still out there," he muttered. Godfrey nodded once. "Good, let him watch. Let him see that faith does not break." But here's the shocking truth. Faith was breaking, only quietly, inside men's hearts. Among the soldiers, doubts spread like whispers. Some said the Turks were demons who could vanish into air. Others swore they had seen angels guiding their arrows. Men began carving crosses into their shields and speaking of omens, the wind that changed direction, the fire that spared a tent, the hawk that circled only the dead. The commanders knew they had to move. Dorylaeum was no place to rest. The desert devoured anything that lingered. So they began their march again, the wounded carried in ox carts, the strong walking with cracked lips and fevered eyes. The land stretched endless and empty. For days, they followed the same pattern: march at dawn, rest at noon, bury the dead at dusk. The silence became heavier than the armor they wore, and every night, when the firelight trembled, they saw the same glow far off, the reflection of Seljuk watchfires beyond the hills. Most people never knew this detail. Kili Arslan hadn't fled in shame. He had withdrawn deliberately, shadowing their path, striking at their foragers, stealing their horses, and poisoning wells before they arrived. He was not fighting battles anymore. He was waging hunger. The Crusaders began to learn what kind of enemy they faced. Not a horde, but a ghost. One evening, the sun dropped behind the mountains like an ember sinking into ash. Bohemond sat with Raymond and Godfrey around a small fire, the only light for miles. Raymond broke the silence first. "We win the battles," he said, "and still we lose men every night. We're not fighting soldiers anymore. We're fighting the land." Bohemond stirred the fire with his sword tip. "Then we conquer the land." Godfrey's voice was quieter. "No, we survive it, and this is where everything changed again." 2 days later, scouts returned with news. Ahead lay a small oasis: trees, water, shade. Hope spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. The column quickened its pace. Men began to smile for the first time since the battle. When they reached the valley, they found water, clear, cool, running from a spring that cut through stone. They dropped to their knees, drinking, laughing, weeping. For a brief hour, the crusade felt human again. But fate had something else planned. At sunset, the first arrow fell, then another. The oasis exploded in motion. Shadows from the cliffs, Seljuk riders sweeping down like falcons. The Turks had waited for the thirst to reach its peak before striking. The Crusaders, still unarmored and scattered, scrambled for weapons. Chaos reigned. Bohemond mounted bareheaded, shouting orders lost in the noise. Arrows tore through the palm leaves. Horses panicked, kicking over the barrels of precious water. The spring ran red. The Crusaders fought back with fury born of desperation. Raymond's knights formed a defensive circle, iron against wind. The Turks darted in and out, firing from all sides. It felt endless, hopeless, until a cry rose from the cliffs above. Crossbowmen. Godfrey had sent them climbing earlier, a precaution against ambush. Now they unleashed a rain of bolts into the riders below. Horses fell screaming. The Seljuks faltered, the attack breaking apart as suddenly as it began. Within moments, the valley was theirs again, but the water was gone, fouled by blood and mud. Bohemond stared at it, the reflection of flames dancing across the surface. "Every victory costs more than the last," he said. Godfrey's reply was low. "And we're not even halfway to Jerusalem." Most people never knew this detail. From that point onward, the Crusaders began carrying small crosses carved from olive wood, gifts from priests who told them the wood would not burn, even in hell's own fire. Men died clutching them. The march resumed. Days blurred into one another. The air grew thinner, the ground rockier. They passed villages long abandoned, bones scattered beside dry wells. Every step forward felt like walking through the ghost of a world that had already fallen. And yet, something in them hardened. The same men who once trembled under the rain of arrows now marched in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. Hunger had carved faith into something sharper than courage. And this is where everything changed one last time. Late one evening, as the column wound through a narrow gorge, a trumpet echoed from the front. Bohemond spurred his horse forward. What he saw made his chest tighten. The plain beyond the gorge opened wide, and there, under the fading light, rose the walls of a distant city, stone towers, pale and ancient, catching the glow of the dying sun. "Antioch," Godfrey breathed. The men began to murmur, then shout, then cry. The sight of it filled them with a joy that was almost painful. They had survived the desert. They had beaten the Sultan. They had reached the edge of the Holy Land. But Bohemond's eyes didn't leave the hills beyond the city, because just visible, on the far horizon, he saw another shimmer of movement. Banners, black and gold, fluttering in the wind. The Seljuks had arrived first. The city they had longed for wasn't salvation. It was a fortress already surrounded by death. Bohemond exhaled slowly. So, the test begins again. The Crusaders stood in the twilight, staring at the gates of Antioch, not yet realizing that the greatest siege of their lives had just begun. And as the night fell over that ghostly city, one truth lingered in the heat and dust. Faith might have carried them this far, but faith alone would not bring them home.